From rejected to winner, when everything seemed lost, I decided to rewrite my story. When I found myself in the middle of a family war, with my parents separating and my life turned upside down, I realized something had to change. I didn't know how or where to begin, but I felt I couldn't stay that way. It was one of those situations where you look to the future and see no clear path, and all you want to do is simply disappear. I was only 17 and already felt the weight of a life that seemed to suffocate me. The idea of staying at home with the daily chaos seemed impossible. So, the solution emerged: moving out to live with my brother Diego and his family. I just wanted to find some peace, but what I found was a new, difficult, and most of the time, uncomfortable environment. At that moment, my life was in turmoil. My brother Diego had always been the center of attention in the family, while I was constantly in his shadow. Nothing I did seemed to be enough, and I felt invisible at home. It was difficult, very difficult, to realize that things wouldn't change easily. Diego had a life, a wife named Cristina, and a young daughter, Annalise, and the arrival of another person in the middle of that routine didn't seem welcome. I, who imagined I would be just another member of the family, quickly realized that my presence wasn't exactly the solution everyone expected. At first, I thought my move to Diego's house would be temporary. Maybe a little space would be enough for things to settle down, and I could return to my old life. But instead, I was met with an indifference that cut me deeply. Diego, whom I'd always admired, seemed more distant than ever. It wasn't just the physical distance between us, but the emotional distance he maintained. Cristina, my sister-in-law, didn't seem very welcoming either. In fact, she was more concerned with getting her own life together than realizing how hard I was trying to find my place there. Things became more difficult. As the days passed, I had my own pain to deal with, a troubled past that haunted me, but no one seemed to notice. Diego was focused on his own life. Cristina was too busy with her own struggles, and even Annalise, my niece, seemed distant, unsure of what to do with me. The house that theoretically should have been a refuge for me quickly became another place where I felt alone and out of place. And as if all this weren't enough, I still carried the frustration of not being able to fit in anywhere. There were times when I wondered why I was there, in that house, in that environment. I tried to talk to Diego, but he responded with the same coldness as always. Cristina, when she wasn't angry, seemed to not see me as part of the family, and Annalise, as a child, had her own difficulties understanding what was happening. I saw myself there searching for connection, but all I found were closed doors. What seemed like an opportunity for a new beginning became yet another burden in my life. Worst of all was the feeling that my presence was a burden to everyone. Every small attempt to fit in seemed futile. The conversations, the glances, even the small daily actions made me realize I was there only because there was no other option. There was no affection, no welcome. I was being pushed into corners, trying to be invisible so as not to be even more of a nuisance. But the pain of being ignored, of not being recognized, weighed on me in a way I never imagined. I didn't know what to do. Each day seemed harder, and the idea of continuing in that place, in that role of someone who didn't matter, made me question the point of even trying. I was starting to lose myself in my own thoughts. Will I ever feel at home here? Will anyone ever see me as anything other than a nuisance? These were the questions that wouldn't leave my head, and the more I thought, the more it seemed the answer was always the same: no. But something inside me, a spark I barely noticed, began to grow. I couldn't let myself sink. I didn't want to be that guy who lets life pass by without fighting for something better. Yes, it was difficult. Yes, the situation seemed hopeless, but even if silent, there was a desire to change. Not for others, but for myself. I needed to do something to escape that feeling of helplessness. I didn't know how, but I knew that if I continued on this path, I would end up losing myself forever. It was at that moment, when everything seemed hopeless, that something inside me decided to resist. I can't pinpoint exactly what changed, but I began to ask myself, what can I do to improve this? I didn't have clear answers, but I knew one thing. I couldn't continue being the person who only complained. I had to start changing from the inside out. With that thought, a slight sense of relief appeared. At least now I had something to focus on, the change within myself. I began taking my first steps. It wasn't anything grand, but I knew that any step I took toward change would be a step toward my own recovery. I began to see Diego differently. Instead of expecting him to be the perfect brother, I began to understand that he too had his own limitations. I began to see him not as someone who rejected me, but as someone who, like me, was dealing with his own struggles. This simple recognition helped me ease the pressure I felt toward him. Things with Christina were more complicated. She always seemed so distant, so busy with her own life. But even so, I decided to start being more present in a calmer way. Instead of trying to force a relationship, I began to accept the reality that she was dealing with her own issues and perhaps didn't have the space to fully accept me at that moment. And so, I took small steps. Not because I wanted to please her, but because I was beginning to realize that the change was starting with me. Annalise, on the other hand, was the hardest part. How could a child understand all the emotional chaos I was immersed in? I decided not to force a connection, but to be present, simply and genuinely. I began to be more attentive, more patient with her, without expecting anything in return. And little by little, I noticed that she began to feel more comfortable around me. Even if it was a small step forward, it meant a lot to me. I was no longer invisible. I was part of something. Even on the difficult days, when everything seemed like it was falling apart, I began to realize that there was something much more important happening. I was rebuilding myself. I was finally accepting myself and realizing that I didn't need the love or acceptance of others to be happy. The change didn't happen overnight, but little by little, I began to feel stronger, more capable. I was learning to be a better person, not for others, but for myself. It was a silent struggle, full of internal challenges, but also full of discoveries. I didn't need great feats to notice the transformation. It was the small victories that kept me going. The simple gestures of care for Annalise, the more open conversations with Diego, and the understanding that Christina was also going through her own difficulties. I was learning to relate to the people around me in a healthier way, without expecting too much, but also without sacrificing myself. Looking back, I see that the greatest victory I've had wasn't getting others to accept me, but learning to accept myself. I understood that ultimately, overcoming obstacles begins within. No matter how difficult the path, I'm not perfect, but I'm on a path of change I never imagined possible. And most importantly, I'm at peace with who I am. Living with Diego remained difficult, but I began to notice small changes. He began to open up more, albeit discreetly. He wasn't an overprotective brother, but the fact that he began to listen to me, even if it was just to talk about everyday life, gave me the feeling that something was changing between us. It wasn't what I expected, but for me, it was a start. Little by little, I stopped being just the brother who lived in their house and became perhaps someone he could count on. It wasn't a perfect bond, but I was rebuilding myself, and that meant something. But as nothing is easy, not every day was good. There were days when the pressure of living there, far from my old life, consumed me completely. I began to question whether I was making the right decisions. Was I really changing, or was it just an illusion I was creating to convince myself that everything was getting better? Frustration and insecurity hit hard, and there were times when I considered turning back, moving back in with my parents, even with all the chaos. But there was something inside me that told me to keep going, that I was making progress, even if only small. The turning point came on one of those days when everything seemed to be falling apart. Diego and Cristina had a heated argument, and I, once again, was the silent spectator. I was tired of being just a spectator in my own life. In that moment, I found myself reflecting on how I had always been on the sidelines, watching things happen around me, but never truly living. That was enough to wake me up. I knew I needed to be more than that, more than someone who merely reacted to the events around me. I had to be someone who took action, who took control of my life. From that day on, I decided to change the way I related to my own pain. Instead of trying to run from it or ignore it, I began to face it head on. I looked at my insecurity, my pain of being excluded, and for the first time, I stopped blaming myself for not being who others expected. I began to focus on how I could heal my wounds without expecting others to heal them for me. This internal shift was the first big step toward truly overcoming my pain. I didn't need approval, recognition. I just needed to allow myself to live my own story. Perhaps the hardest part was realizing that I could no longer wait for Diego or Cristina to resolve my emotional issues. I was searching for something in everyone around me, but I realized that what I needed was within myself. I learned that instead of seeking love and acceptance, I should start giving it to myself first. The idea of being accepted by others stopped being an obsession. The most important thing was accepting myself, and this, little by little, created a new perspective. It wasn't about pleasing others, but about being true to myself. One afternoon, when Diego and Cristina were talking about future plans, I found myself in a moment of reflection. I looked at them and realized that, although our relationship was still fragile, a bond was forming. It wasn't perfect, but it was there. Diego's words of support at that moment, however simple, meant the world to me. Something inside me clicked. I didn't need unconditional support, but the certainty that, even with the difficulties, we were capable of finding a way to be together in a new, more mature way. It was at that moment that I began to see my relationship with Annalise differently. Before, I'd seen myself as a stranger to her, someone she didn't know how to deal with. But at that moment, I realized that my niece, despite her young age, was already showing more understanding than I'd imagined. I began to dedicate myself more to her, but not in a forced way. I felt that, instead of trying to please her, the important thing was to be genuine, and she began to respond to that in a much more positive way than I expected. Transforming myself was a constant struggle. Each day brought new challenges, but also new discoveries. When things seemed difficult, I asked myself, what am I learning from this? This helped me focus on what really mattered. I was becoming stronger, more aware of who I truly was, and this gave me a new perspective on life and how I related to others. I began to feel more secure in my own skin, and it was at that moment that I realized something fundamental. True change doesn't come from outside, but from within. It wasn't the actions of others that needed to change. It was my perception of them. I began to see my family differently, not as sources of rejection, but as human beings with their own flaws and challenges. This didn't make things perfect, but it helped me understand that overcoming things lay in accepting what I couldn't change and acting on what I could. The process of overcoming grief didn't happen all at once. It took shape gradually, day by day. Each interaction, each gesture of patience and understanding, however small, helped me grow closer to the person I wanted to be. It wasn't a grand transformation, but rather a series of small steps that allowed me to see that true change begins within. And this was my greatest lesson. Overcoming grief doesn't come from a moment of revelation, but from a silent journey, full of ups and downs. When I look back, I realize how much I've grown. I'm no longer the person who arrived there, afraid, insecure, and lost. Today, I can look at myself and say, I've found my place in life, in my family, and most importantly, within myself. It wasn't easy. It's not easy. But each step has brought me closer to the person I am now. I've learned to respect and value myself, and with that, my relationships with others have also changed. No matter how far I still am from perfection, the important thing is that I'm moving forward, and that's already a victory. I know there's still much to learn and many difficulties to face, but today I feel more prepared to face them. With each challenge, I remember my own strength, my ability to overcome, even when it seems all is lost. I learned that life isn't about being perfect, but about continuing, even when obstacles seem insurmountable. And with that, I gave myself the chance to rewrite my story. Today, I can look at my family with different eyes. Diego, Christina, Annalise. We're not perfect, but we're learning to understand each other and support each other more sincerely and genuinely. The transformation I've begun within myself has been reflected in the way I see my family and how I relate to them. I know we still have a long way to go, but the difference is that now we're together more openly, more honestly, and above all, more human. The most beautiful thing about all this is that even with all the flaws and difficulties, I learned to love myself. And by loving myself, I learned to love others. Every step I took brought me closer to who I truly am, and that gave me the strength to keep going, to fight, to never give up on being a better person. It's not a perfect happy ending, but it's an ending that makes sense, and that's what matters. I finished my journey, but I know it never truly ends. There will always be more to learn, more to grow. Overcoming obstacles is an ongoing process, and I'm ready to move forward. The story isn't over, it's just begun. And with the strength I've found within myself, I know I can face anything that comes my way.